The courtroom felt unusually electric that morning, tense, charged, almost humming with unspoken expectation. Rows of spectators leaned forward in their seats, phones silenced but ready, their eyes fixed on the polished wooden bench where Judge Frank Caprio would soon appear. The room smelled faintly of old books, camera batteries, and something else, anticipation. Then came the sound. Click. 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 Cameras snapped like insects buzzing, capturing each second as the billionaire strutted in. He didn't walk, he glided, chin raised, arms swinging loosely, wearing the kind of smug smile that only comes from a life spent being told yes. His tailored charcoal suit fit him like a second skin, and the confidence dripping from his expression made it clear he didn't believe he was here to be judged. He believed he was here to be admired. He sank into his seat and leaned back, legs crossed, fingers tapping the desk like a drummer bored during rehearsal. He wasn't intimidated, not even slightly. If anything, he looked annoyed, like this courtroom was a minor inconvenience in his billionaire schedule. Then the door opened. Judge Frank Caprio entered with the quiet dignity he was known for. The entire room stood out of respect, everyone except him. The billionaire didn't move. He simply smirked. Caprio took his place. "You may be seated," he said gently. The courtroom settled into silence. Papers rustled. A clerk coughed softly. And then, without warning, without provocation, the billionaire leaned forward, eyes gleaming with something venomous. "You know," he said loudly enough for the microphones to catch, "I'm surprised someone from your background made it this far. Must have been tough, huh, especially for a family like yours." The words crashed into the room like a dropped hammer. Gasps erupted instantly. An older woman covered her mouth. One man shook his head in disbelief. From the back row, someone whispered the sentence none of them could process. Did he really say that? To Judge Caprio. But the judge didn't react, not visibly, his eyes lowered just slightly, not in shame, but in a kind of profound disappointment that felt heavier than anger. It wasn't the insult to him. It was the insult to his family. A silence spread across the courtroom, thick and suffocating, and the billionaire, still smirking, thought he'd won some twisted victory. He had no idea he'd just lit the fuse. But the billionaire had no idea. That single sentence would become the moment that destroyed his carefully crafted empire. The insult hadn't just unsettled the room, it had cracked something in the atmosphere, as if the temperature dropped a degree. Even before Judge Caprio opened his mouth, whispers rippled through the courtroom like wind passing over tall grass. Everyone knew this hearing mattered. But now? Now it felt historic. Because this wasn't a routine civil suit. This wasn't a petty dispute. This was the case that had placed a billionaire tech magnate, one of the world's most powerful men, under scrutiny for predatory data harvesting practices that targeted the very people society already overlooked. Low-income families, immigrants, seniors, single mothers juggling 2 jobs and 1 cracked phone screen. For months, online watchdog groups had been asking the same question. How much does your privacy cost when someone else is willing to sell it? The billionaire's company had built sleek apps with friendly icons and pastel colors, promising users convenience. But buried deep, pages deep, inside deceptive terms and conditions, the company siphoned sensitive data, income levels, personal habits, medical searches, debt patterns. It wasn't just unethical. It was exploitative. The public already doubted him. Reporters had begun circling like vultures. Editorials were asking whether tech innovation had become a mask for digital colonization. But his arrogance that morning, mocking Judge Caprio's family in a room full of cameras, did something even scandals couldn't do. It made the entire nation pay attention. Within minutes, as spectators discreetly sent messages under their benches, social media began to buzz. Headlines started appearing online faster than the stenographer could type. Billionaire accused of exploiting low-income families, smirks in court. Disrespect in the courtroom, tech titan belittles judge's family. America watches as Caprio faces down a billionaire. Cable news hosts interrupted segments to cover the breaking moment. Talk shows rolled back their scripts. Political commentators sharpened their takes in real time. The hearing had crossed from legal matter to cultural lightning rod. And Judge Caprio, known nationwide for compassion, fairness, and the ability to see the human behind the mistake, was suddenly positioned against a man who represented the worst kind of modern power, unregulated, unaccountable, untouchable. Except today. He wasn't untouchable. Spectators in the courtroom began to recognize the magnitude of what they were witnessing. What began as a technical hearing about consent laws and digital privacy had transformed into an emotional battle about dignity, respect, and class. The billionaire, realizing cameras were on him, adjusted his cufflinks and leaned back again, double down rather than pull back. That was his instinct. That had always been his instinct. He'd built his empire by steamrolling critics until they couldn't afford to speak. But the courtroom was not Silicon Valley. And Judge Caprio was not a board member he could intimidate. More messages buzzed. A teenager in the back row mouthed, "This is crazy." A middle-aged man clenched his jaw, shaking his head. Even the bailiff, usually stoic, shifted his weight uneasily. Every minute, the stakes tightened like a noose. The case was no longer about data practices. It was about character. It was about humanity. It was about whether someone with unimaginable wealth could look into the eyes of the public and still behave as though he owned the air they breathed. The billionaire thought it was just another day, another petty inconvenience. He didn't understand that some lines, especially those involving family, heritage, and dignity, carry consequences money cannot shield you from. And the judge, sitting in quiet poise, wasn't simply preparing to deliver justice. He was preparing to reveal truth. And yet, this wasn't even the beginning of his downfall. Long before he sat smirking in Judge Caprio's courtroom, the billionaire had been crafting an image, one so carefully constructed, it blurred the line between genius and godhood. His rise had been meteoric, a college dropout who transformed a small software tool into a tech empire valued in the tens of billions. To the public, he branded himself as an innovator. To his followers, he sold himself as a visionary. To his investors, he presented himself as indispensable. But to those who worked closest to him, he was something else entirely. Inside the headquarters of his gleaming tech fortress, 16 floors of glass, cold steel, and silence, employees whispered stories that never made it to the press. Stories of how he'd stride through open-concept offices like a king inspecting his subjects, stopping only to belittle a junior engineer for a minor delay or publicly mock a designer's concept sketch. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words cut clean and precise, like a scalpel. You call that innovation? Do you even understand what excellence looks like? I don't pay you to think like average people. Behind closed doors, his board knew the truth. The company thrived not because of him, but in spite of him. The real geniuses were the engineers he underpaid and overworked, many of whom came from the same low-income backgrounds he quietly despised. But his ego? It only grew. Over the years, he perfected his tech messiah persona. On stage during product launches, he spoke with theatrical pauses, hands spread wide as though blessing the crowd. Every word dripped with self-importance. He didn't pitch apps. He preached gospel. His social media accounts became battlegrounds. He ranted about lazy employees, mocked critics as irrelevant peasants, and dismissed regulatory concerns as government tantrums. Insults weren't accidents, they were habits, patterns, a worldview. Whenever an employee resigned, he'd retweet memes mocking quitters. Whenever a journalist questioned him, he'd call them intellectually bankrupt. And whenever anyone challenged his ethics, he'd drown them with lawyers, NDAs, and threats wrapped in corporate politeness. But the most dangerous shift came after his first billion. Wealth didn't just change him, it warped him. The more untouchable he became, the more the world around him bent to his will. His assistants apologized for things they didn't do. His executives agreed to decisions they knew were disastrous. His board showered him with praise even when he was wrong. And over time, the illusion solidified. He believed he could never lose. He developed a habit of viewing institutions, schools, unions, government offices, and courts as outdated relics, beneath his intellect and irrelevant to his world. So when he walked into Judge Caprio's courtroom, he didn't see law or justice. He saw inconvenience. He saw a small city judge, the kind he believed existed to serve people like him. A man with modest credentials. A courtroom without marble pillars or corporate luxury, and when he insulted Judge Caprio's family, it wasn't a slip of the tongue. Not a moment of heat. Not an accident. It was the purest expression of who he had always been. This was the same man who once told an interviewer, "Some people rise. Some people are born to stay in the shadows. It's not cruelty, it's nature." This was the same man who laughed about outsourcing operations to save a fraction of a percent in labor costs while hundreds of workers lost their jobs. This was the man who built his empire on the belief that power belonged to the loudest voice, the biggest bank account, the highest floor in the tallest building. Money had insulated him, fame had validated him, yes, men had worshipped him, and slowly, bit by bit, he began to believe he was above everything, and everyone. That's why he felt comfortable mocking a judge in public. That's why he believed insulting Caprio's family would rattle him. That's why he sat with his smug grin, convinced the world still belonged to him. But arrogance has a way of blinding even the smartest men. And while he was busy rising into the clouds of his own ego, while he was celebrating the empire built on exploitation and entitlement, he didn't notice something far more powerful happening quietly in the background. Because as his ego grew unchecked, another man, humble, patient, unwavering, was building something he could never buy, a lifetime of respect. But while his arrogance grew, someone else was quietly building a lifetime of respect. Before the cameras, before the viral videos, before his name became a symbol of compassion across countless screens, Judge Frank Caprio was simply Francesco, the son of immigrants who came to America with more hope than money. His childhood wasn't built on luxury or power, it was built on the kind of humility and warmth that grows only in homes where every small blessing is earned, not inherited. He grew up in a tightly knit neighborhood where families left their doors unlocked and kids played in the streets until the sun dipped below the rooftops. His father, an Italian immigrant with calloused hands and a permanently tired smile, worked multiple jobs to keep food on the table. Yet no matter how exhausted he was, he greeted everyone with kindness, neighbors, strangers, even the occasional troublemaker. And it was from him that young Francesco learned the lesson that would define his entire life. No one is too small to deserve kindness. Those words weren't just advice. They were a way of living. He watched his father offer helping hands without expecting anything in return. He watched him share meals with families who had less. He watched him defend people who couldn't defend themselves, not with wealth or influence, but with dignity and patience. Those small acts shaped Frank Caprio's sense of justice long before he ever set foot in a courtroom. He never dreamed of becoming powerful. He dreamed of becoming useful. As he grew older, he realized that the world wasn't always as fair as the home he'd been raised in. Teachers favored wealthy students, employers overlooked hard-working immigrants. And the legal system, often cold, rigid, unyielding, felt like a place where ordinary people could easily be crushed. So he made a choice. He would enter the law not to rewrite the rules, but to make them human. When Caprio began practicing as an attorney, he quickly became known as the people's lawyer. His clients weren't corporations or wealthy businessmen, they were factory workers, single parents, struggling neighbors who needed someone to stand beside them when life pushed too hard. He didn't measure success in money earned, but in problems solved. It didn't take long for the community to notice. His reputation for compassion was so steady, so consistent, that it eventually carried him into the very seat where he would shape countless lives, the bench. And from the moment he first put on the black robe, something changed, not in him, but in the courtroom. Defendants who walked in trembling often left with tears in their eyes, but not from punishment, from relief, from being seen, from being understood. One moment in particular crystallized everything Judge Caprio represented. It was years before today's hearing, but still shared across social media as one of the most heartwarming judicial stories of the decade. A young mother entered his courtroom with her toddler. She had received a parking ticket, $100 she didn't have. She worked nights, struggled to afford childcare, and sometimes, in her desperation, left her car in restricted zones while rushing between shifts. Her voice quivered as she explained her situation. Her hands trembled as she held her child. Her eyes glistened with a helplessness that spoke louder than her words. Most judges would have simply enforced the fine. Rules are rules. Laws are laws. Life is hard. Too bad. But Judge Caprio didn't see a violation. He saw a mother fighting every day to survive. He leaned forward gently and asked her one simple question. What do you need right now to make things better for your family? Her tears finally spilled. Because no one had asked her that before. Then, with the quiet grace he was known for, Judge Caprio dismissed the fine entirely. He told her she deserved a chance to breathe. He told her she was doing the best she could. He told her she mattered. The courtroom applauded, not because he broke the rules, but because he restored humanity within them. Clips of the interaction spread online. Millions watched. Millions cried. Millions understood what true justice looked like, not cold, not mechanical, not harsh, but compassionate, empathetic, rooted in the belief that the law should protect people, not crush them. This is who Judge Caprio was long before today. Not a man of power, but a man of principle. Not someone who sought fame, but someone who earned respect without asking for it. Which made today's insult, delivered with such smugness by a billionaire who had known only privilege, all the more disgusting. The billionaire saw Caprio as a small city judge. But the world knew better. The world knew that humility wasn't weakness, kindness wasn't naivety, compassion wasn't incompetence. It was strength, it was integrity. It was character. Qualities the billionaire had never possessed, and could never buy, so when he mocked Judge Caprio's family, he wasn't just attacking a man, he was attacking everything that makes justice meaningful, everything that makes humanity noble, everything that millions cherish in the judge who has inspired countless people around the world. And there, sitting in silence after the billionaire's cruel remark, Caprio didn't show anger, he didn't raise his voice, he didn't strike the gavel in frustration, because a lifetime of service had taught him something deeper than retaliation. This moment was not about ego. It was about truth. And truth, when revealed, has a way of tearing down even the tallest towers of pride. And those values were about to become the billionaire's biggest nightmare. The air in the courtroom had shifted. What began as a routine hearing now carried the sharp, crackling tension of something far more volatile. Every eye, legal teams, spectators, clerks, was fixed on the billionaire who sat sprawled in his chair like he owned not just the courtroom, but the entire building. His confidence wasn't confidence at all. It was performance. A show of dominance. And he was about to crank it up. The moment Judge Caprio began outlining the charges, the billionaire let out a loud, exaggerated sigh, not the kind of sigh that escapes unintentionally, but the kind designed to be heard, to mock, to belittle. Then came the interruptions. Well, actually, let me stop you right there. I think you're misunderstanding how business works. With all due respect, Judge, though frankly, there isn't much due. Each interjection was sharper than the last, dripping with sarcasm. His legal team shifted uncomfortably, pretending to read documents while silently begging him to stop talking. But he didn't. When Judge Caprio mentioned procedural matters, the billionaire chuckled. A slow, deliberate laugh that echoed through the room. Cute, he muttered under his breath, loud enough for everyone to hear. Then he leaned back, crossed his arms, and smirked as if he were watching a child struggle through advanced math. But it didn't end there. As Judge Caprio reviewed the next section of the case, the billionaire suddenly raised his eyebrows and said, "You know, for a guy your age, I'm impressed you can still read without assistance. They should give you a bigger font." A stunned silence fell. Even his own attorney closed his eyes in regret. This wasn't confidence anymore. This was open disrespect. A young clerk whispered to her colleague. "Is he serious?" Her phone buzzed. Notifications were already rolling in. Someone had quietly live-streamed a short clip of the billionaire's mocking laughter, and social media was beginning to take notice. Within minutes, more phones lit up across the courtroom. Tweets. Posts. Shares. The billionaire's arrogance was spreading across the internet like wildfire. He didn't care. If anything, it fueled him. He leaned forward across the table, invading the space between him and the judge with a smug grin. "Let's be honest, Judge," he said. "This whole situation, it's beneath me. And it's definitely beneath someone of your seniority. Shouldn't you be enjoying retirement instead of pretending to run a courtroom?" A few gasps scattered the room. Even the reporter in the back dropped her pen. But Judge Caprio did not flinch. He didn't raise a brow, didn't shift in his seat, didn't fire back. He simply looked at the billionaire with the same steady, composed gaze he'd used on nervous teenagers, overworked parents, and frightened immigrants. A gaze that didn't judge. A gaze that didn't waver. A gaze that said, "You cannot move me." And that, more than any punishment, infuriated the billionaire. He wanted a reaction. He needed one. His whole life, people reacted to him. They feared him. Admired him. Obeyed him. But this judge, this quiet, aging, unshakable man, did none of those things. The billionaire slammed his palm onto the table, a loud sharp crack echoed through the courtroom. "This is ridiculous," he barked. "Do you not understand who you're talking to?" His lawyers attempted to calm him, whispering frantically, "Sir, please, this is not helping." But he shoved their hands away. The tension was now so thick it was hard to breathe. Through all of it, Judge Caprio remained still. Calm, measured. His silence wasn't weakness. It was control. Social media was now fully engulfed in the spectacle. Livestream fragments were stacking up. Comments flooded timelines. "Why is he talking to Judge Caprio like that? This billionaire is digging his own grave. Caprio's calm is terrifying. This man has no idea." But the billionaire was too consumed by his own ego to notice the storm building outside the courtroom walls. He sneered again, tapping his fingers impatiently. "Well?" he demanded. "Are you going to say something, or do you need a minute to catch your breath?" That was when Judge Caprio finally leaned forward, slowly, purposefully. The room went silent. Even the billionaire paused, mid-smirk. Judge Caprio looked at him with the patience of a man who had seen every kind of arrogance over the decades, but never quite this brand. Then, in a level, almost gentle voice, he asked, "Tell me, what are you so afraid of?" And the entire courtroom froze. For a long moment after Judge Caprio's question, "What are you so afraid of?" the billionaire simply stared, caught between outrage and confusion. It was the first time anyone had spoken to him that way without trembling afterward. Cameras zoomed in, pens hovered over notepads. The world inside that courtroom seemed to shrink around the two men. Judge Caprio didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. He merely reached for a folder beside him, thin, neatly organized, unassuming. But the billionaire's eyes twitched. He recognized that kind of folder. It was the kind lawyers dreaded. The kind CEOs feared. The kind filled with things that should never see daylight. Caprio opened it slowly. "Sir," he began, his voice calm enough to still the air, "you've insisted repeatedly that your company's practices were harmless. That you never targeted those who could not defend themselves." The billionaire rolled his eyes. "Because it's true." Caprio continued as though the interruption never happened. "So I'd like to enter into the record a set of documents recently submitted by your former employees." The billionaire's jaw tightened. "These," Caprio said, lifting the first page, "are internal emails." A ripple of tension swept the courtroom, but the judge didn't pause. "In them," he continued, "you refer to low-income families, the same ones filing claims against your company, as quote, data livestock." Gasps erupted across the room. A woman in the second row covered her heart with her hand. A reporter mouthed the words silently. "Data livestock?" The billionaire's face twitched into a defensive smirk. "They're taken out of context." Caprio nodded thoughtfully. "Very well. Let's add context." He lifted another page. "Here, you write. They click anything we put in front of them. They don't read terms. They barely read at all. Perfect targets." This time the gasp was louder. A clerk actually flinched. Even the billionaire's own attorney visibly winced. The billionaire leaned forward, voice raised. Those emails were jokes. Team chatter. Nothing serious. Caprio finally looked up, directly into his eyes. Jokes, he repeated softly, as though tasting the word. About the families you exploited. The billionaire opened his mouth, then closed it. His smirk was wobbling. But Judge Caprio wasn't finished. He placed the emails aside and folded his hands. Sir, he said. In this courtroom, we do not determine character by wealth, power, or public image. We determine it by actions, by choices, and by the respect one shows to others. The room was so quiet now that a single cough echoed like a shout. And that brings me, Caprio continued, to the comment you made earlier this morning. The billionaire's shoulders tensed. He knew exactly which comment. Caprio did not look angry. He did not look hurt. He looked steady, anchored by something deeper. You insulted my family. He said simply. Not with passion. Not in a moment of frustration. But with intention. A murmur rippled through the spectators. Caprio raised a hand, gentle but firm, and the room went silent again. Sir, he said. I have spent my life listening to people from all backgrounds, immigrants, the poor, the frightened, people who often feel invisible. My father taught me to treat every person who stands before me with dignity. He leaned forward slightly. In this courtroom, we respect all families. The words were a whisper, but they struck like a hammer. Then Caprio added softly. Even yours. The silence that followed was absolute. Cameras snapped. A reporter's pen dropped. A man in the back whispered, "Oh my God." And for the first time since he'd entered the room, the billionaire's smirk faltered completely. His jaw twitched, his eyes darted. He looked suddenly, unmistakably human, and vulnerable. Caprio let the weight of the moment settle before turning back to the folder. Now, he said, let's address the claims you've insisted are fabrications. His voice sharpened, not in anger, but in precision. He laid out charts showing the spike in unauthorized data collection. He presented testimony from families who had been coerced by deceptive pop-ups and hidden opt-ins. He compared the billionaire's public statements with confidential reports showing he was fully aware his system preyed on financially desperate households. Each piece of evidence dismantled another lie. Another wall. Another layer of arrogance. The billionaire's posture shrank inch by inch. His hands, once confidently folded, now tapped nervously, his tongue darted over dry lips, but Caprio wasn't finished. You've stated that your practices were legal, he said. Yet this document, signed by your own compliance officer, warns you explicitly that your methods violated federal data use guidelines. The billionaire blurted, that memo was never meant for. Caprio cut him off with a gentle raise of his hand. I know, he said. That is the problem. Cameras caught everything, every twitch, every crack in the billionaire's armor. Caprio closed the folder with the quiet finality of a vault door. Sir, he said, you came here believing that this court, this community, and this judge were beneath you. You believed your wealth placed you above responsibility, above accountability, above the families you harmed. The billionaire stared, trapped. Caprio's voice softened again, dangerously. But justice, he said, does not rise for the powerful, it rises for the powerless. The line hit the courtroom like thunder. A young reporter mouthed, that's going viral. Another spectator wiped away tears. Caprio continued. You asked earlier if I understand who I'm talking to. I assure you, I do. He leaned back with dignified composure. The real question, sir, is whether you understand who you are. The billionaire swallowed hard. No smirk. No comeback. No performance left. Only silence. Judge Caprio gathered the documents, set them aside, and spoke the words that would soon circle the world in headlines, memes, and courtroom history. Power does not make a man. Character does. And with that, the billionaire's final thread of confidence snapped. As the judge prepared to move to the next phase of proceedings, a whisper seemed to move through the air, part warning, part prophecy. Within hours, the world would witness consequences he never imagined. By the time the courtroom doors closed, the ripple effect had already become a tsunami. Within minutes, the Caprio justice was trending on every major platform. Notifications pinged relentlessly as millions of people, viewers, journalists, activists, shared the clips, screenshots and GIFs of Judge Caprio's calm dismantling of the billionaire's arrogance. Memes appeared almost instantly, side-by-side images of the billionaire's smug smirk collapsing next to Caprio's serene gaze. One viral post simply read, "Smug billionaire meets human decency," another showed a gilded throne with the caption, "This seat is for humility, not arrogance." Laughter, awe and disbelief cascaded through social feeds. Celebrities and influencers weighed in, lending their voices to a conversation that had taken the country by storm. Late-night hosts interrupted their monologues, replaying the most cinematic courtroom moments. Talk shows devoted segments to analyzing Caprio's technique, the way he spoke with authority, the way he let silence amplify his message, the way dignity itself had become a weapon. Financial markets, of course, did not remain immune. Investors, watching the social media firestorm and the media coverage, began to react. The billionaire's stock, previously stable despite ongoing legal scrutiny, started a sharp decline as news of the courtroom exchange spread. Shares fell almost in real time, erasing billions in valuation. Analysts rushed to assess damage control, while nervous investors called their brokers in a panic. Even internal communications at the billionaire's company were ablaze. Employees, emboldened by Caprio's example, quietly began speaking out about workplace misconduct, unethical practices, and the years of pressure to maintain the empire at all costs. Sponsors and partners, once eager to associate with the company's glimmering public image, pulled back, not wanting their brands tied to someone now publicly framed as an entitled bully. The narrative had shifted. For years, he had been called a visionary, a genius, a tech messiah. Within a day the story had rewritten itself. Headlines no longer praised innovation, they questioned ethics. Social commentary labeled him arrogant, disconnected, and dangerous. The man who had once seemed untouchable had become a cautionary tale, a figure to be scrutinized and, in many ways, pitied. Meanwhile, Judge Caprio's reputation soared even higher. Across the nation, ordinary citizens shared their admiration for the man who had spoken truth to power with patience, composure, and integrity. School children watched clips in classrooms, social justice advocates cited his demeanor in debates, and local communities celebrated him as an example of principled leadership. Caprio had not only defended the powerless that day, he had reminded the world what justice, dignity, and courage truly looked like. Media outlets dissected every moment of the hearing, his pauses, the tone of his voice, the subtle yet devastating use of evidence. Analysts marveled at the psychological mastery, noting how his calm had dismantled the billionaire's ego more efficiently than anger ever could. Public forums filled with discussions about accountability, humility, and the responsibilities that come with power. Even long after the courtroom emptied, the echoes persisted. Every retweet, every viral clip, every online thread acted like a pulse, sending waves of reflection and debate across the nation. Citizens who had previously felt powerless watched as a man of principle demonstrated that one individual, armed only with dignity, truth, and preparation, could create seismic cultural and social impact. For the billionaire, the consequences were already unfolding. Not only had his public image suffered irreversible damage, but the internal chaos within his company grew. Investors demanded explanations, employees sought protections, partners reconsidered contracts. What he had believed was his dominion, the market, public opinion, the courts, was no longer secure. And through it all, Judge Caprio remained unshaken. He had not gloatingly savored the collapse of his opponent, rather, he had allowed justice itself to speak. His calm had amplified the truth, showing the world that power can be challenged without losing one's humanity, and that accountability is not just a legal concept, it is a moral imperative. The headlines would continue for weeks, debates for months, and lessons for years. Caprio's example spread far beyond the courtroom walls, inspiring conversations in offices, homes, schools, and online communities. People began to see that real influence doesn't always come from wealth or title, it comes from integrity, courage, and the quiet confidence to do what is right. But beneath all the noise lay a deeper lesson, one the nation needed to hear. Judge Caprio leaned forward slightly, letting the weight of the moment settle over the courtroom like a quiet storm. Cameras captured every detail, the composed lines of his face, the steady rhythm of his breath, the calm clarity in his eyes. But what no camera could fully convey was the authority in his voice, not just legal authority, but moral authority, forged over decades of service, humility, and unwavering principle. "Today," he began, "we have witnessed more than a trial. We have witnessed a choice. A choice about how we treat one another, a choice about how power is exercised, a choice about what we value as a society." His words carried effortlessly across the room, yet they reverberated far beyond these walls, reaching anyone who had followed the spectacle through live streams, news outlets, or social media feeds. Respect is not granted by wealth. Dignity is not measured by status. Accountability is not optional for those who hold influence. He paused, letting each sentence sink in. The billionaire's legal team shifted uneasily, realizing that these were not just statements, they were the framework of a judgment no amount of money could evade. Caprio's eyes swept the courtroom, landing briefly on the man who had so arrogantly mocked him and his family. "You were given every opportunity to act with integrity," he said. "You could have conducted yourself with humility, you could have respected the lives and struggles of those your company touched, you could have acknowledged that privilege carries responsibility, not just in the marketplace, but in the hearts and minds of the people we serve." A murmur passed through the spectators, hushed but unanimous. The truth was undeniable, it wasn't just a legal argument, it was a moral reckoning. "And family," he continued, "is not merely a word or a symbol, it is the foundation upon which our communities, our laws and our conscience are built. To insult it is to strike at the very values that hold society together, it is to assume that one's position, one's wealth, or one's fame can shield them from the consequences of dishonor." The room was silent. The billionaire, once so cocky and untouchable, now sat frozen, a man confronted not only by the law but by the universal measure of human decency. Caprio's words widened in scope, reaching beyond the courtroom, beyond the walls of any building. "To all who watch, let this serve as a reminder. Arrogance collapses when faced with truth. Power without principle is a house built on sand, but integrity stands. It stands because it is anchored in service, in humility, and in the courage to do what is right even when it is difficult, even when it is inconvenient, even when no one is watching." He straightened, lifting the folder of evidence slightly, not as a threat but as a symbol. "Each of us," he said, "has a responsibility. Those with influence must exercise it wisely. Those with voice must use it honestly. Those with privilege must never forget the power of compassion. And those of us entrusted with justice must always remember that the law is a servant of humanity, not a weapon for the entitled." Caprio leaned back and allowed a final thought to linger in the air, heavy and inescapable. The lesson is simple, yet profound. Wealth can be spent, power can be challenged, and arrogance can be exposed, but integrity cannot be bought. Respect cannot be faked. Accountability cannot be evaded. These are the constants that endure beyond headlines, beyond viral moments, beyond fleeting fame. Every spectator, every journalist, every viewer witnessing the event realized that what they had seen was more than a courtroom confrontation, it was a modern-day moral parable. A billionaire humbled not by force, not by insult, but by the quiet, unassailable truth of decency. The courtroom exhaled collectively. The weight of history seemed present in that single, unassuming room. Lessons that would resonate far beyond these walls, far beyond this city, were written in the way Caprio had conducted himself. Calm, measured, just, unwavering. And as social media posts continued to circulate, echoing his words, one truth became undeniably clear. Wealth may command attention, power may demand fear, but character demands respect. And that leads us to the final truth every viewer needs to remember. And so the story comes full circle. A billionaire, once untouchable, humiliated by his own arrogance. A courtroom transformed into a stage for truth, dignity, and the enduring power of integrity. The insults, the smirks, the interruptions, all had led to this moment, a lesson that wealth and influence can never replace respect, and that accountability always finds its way. Social media still buzzed with #CaprioJustice. Stock prices had dropped, investors reeled, employees spoke openly for the first time, sponsors distanced themselves, and yet, above all the noise, the enduring image remained Judge Caprio, calm, composed and unshakable, a symbol of justice and humanity that no viral headline could ever tarnish. This was more than a courtroom drama. It was a modern-day parable, a reminder that in every sphere of life, business, politics, or personal choices, how we treat others defines our legacy. Arrogance collapses. Integrity stands. Respect matters. Accountability matters. Family matters. Now it's your turn to act. Share this story so more people remember, dignity is the greatest power we have. Let it spark conversations, inspire change, and remind those in positions of influence that character cannot be bought. And for those who want to witness more high-drama, justice-centered political narratives that reveal the human side of power, subscribe and join us. Stay connected to stories where morality meets spectacle, where truth meets tension, and where courage shines brighter than any fortune. The lesson is clear. The message is timeless. And the world is watching. Because in the end, the most powerful force isn't wealth, it's integrity.